notes. We're doing it a little bit differently, so I am going to be pre-recording the notes and you're going to be watching them now in class. You are able to pause at any point to fill in the blanks that you need to, so don't feel like you have to continue with me. You can stop at any point in time to make sure that your notes are getting filled in. Please make sure your name is on your notes in case I need to return them to you for any reason. Okay, so property of matter. You guys should all know what the definition of matter is at this point. So matter is anything that has mass and occupies space. Anything that has mass and occupies space. How does one describe the quantities of matter? Well, there's three different ways that we need to consider. The first being volume. Volume is the amount of three-dimensional space that an object occupies. Weight is a measure of the gravitational pull on matter. These are not reliable. Volume and weight can change depending on temperature and location. Okay, so again, mass and volume and weight cannot be considered reliable because they are solely dependent on temperature and location. Mass, however, is a reliable way to measure matter. Mass is a measure of the amount of matter that is present. Mass is not affected by temperature or location like volume and weight are. Weight is a measure of the Earth's gravitational force on the body. So you guys know this. You've all watched something or learned how gravity is different on the moon. So therefore, an astronaut will have a different weight on the moon, but his mass will remain the same. So we know that the moon doesn't have as much gravitational pull as it does here on Earth. Therefore, someone is going to weigh more here on Earth than they actually would on the moon. However, our mass on Earth and the moon would still be the same. Mass is consistent. Mass does not change, whereas weight does depending on your location. So we need to ask the question, why is mass a more reliable measure of the quantity of a sample of matter than weight or volume? Again, simply because the mass will be constant regardless of other factors like temperature, pressure, or location. Here's a couple of terms that you guys should be familiar with already at this point. So now we're moving on to talking about elements and compounds. The fundamental building blocks of matter are atoms and molecules. You guys at this point should already know what an atom and a molecule is, but a simple definition for an atom is the smallest unit of an element that retains the properties of that element. If you have a highlighter out, I suggest that you highlight these two definitions because you will need to know them and you will be quizzed over them. So again, an atom is the smallest unit of an element. A molecule, on the other hand, is a neutral group of atoms held together by covalent bonds. So this is when you have two atoms that are basically joined and held together by a covalent bond. All matter can be classified into three groups, okay? And you need to, again, highlight this. These three groups are important. You're going to have to know these. The three groups of matter are elements, compounds, and mixtures. Now, this is going to be different than the three types of matter that we're going to talk about here shortly, which is your solids, liquids, and gases. So the three groups are elements, compounds, and mixtures. An element. You guys should all know what an element is at this point. After talking about the periodic table of elements, you should be familiar with all of them and what it consists of. So an element is a pure substance made up of only one kind of matter. It also is a substance that cannot be broken down into any other substances by ordinary means. So an element is basically in its simplest form. We talked already about how inside an atom you have a nucleus, which is that purple center that you see there, right here. There are also electrons. We said that electrons are constantly moving at a very rapid pace so that you can't ever necessarily pinpoint exactly where they're going to be. We said that that nucleus in the middle consists of protons and neutrons. A compound is a substance made up of two or more elements that are chemically combined. Okay, so compounds is when you have two or more elements chemically combined. A compound can be broken down into simpler form, whereas we said an element cannot be broken down into simpler form. An element is in its simplest form, whereas a compound, since it consists of two elements that are chemically combined, there is a way to separate them into a simpler substance. So an example that you guys should all be familiar with at this point is water. So water is a compound composed of elements hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, you guys have all heard of H2O. It's 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. Water can be broken down into its individual elements of hydrogen and oxygen. Here are some characteristics of a compound. The element making up a compound are combined in a definite proportion by mass. The proportion of one ratio is the same for all samples of a compound. Number 2, the set of chemical and physical properties of a compound differ from those of its constituents. So, for example, the properties of water are different from the properties of oxygen and hydrogen. So basically, when you're combining these elements and chemically combining them, they lose their original properties, basically to kind of become something else. Number 3, compounds can be formed from simpler substances by chemical change. One thing that's new this year for you guys that we're going to be focusing on is mixtures. A mixture is a combination of 2 or more substances that are not chemically combined. 2 or more substances that are not chemically combined. Each of the individual substances retain its own individual properties. The properties of a mixture are a combination of the properties of its components. The parts of a mixture are simply mixed together physically and can usually be separated. So again, for mixtures, 2 or more substances that are chemically combined. There are 2 main types of mixtures that we're going to be discussing this year. For this slide, it says, how are mixtures distinguished from elements and compounds? An element or compound has one set of properties, but a mixture retains the properties of each of its constituents. This characteristic can be used to separate a mixture into its constituents. So the composition of a compound is fixed, but the composition of a mixture can vary. Here are your 2 types of mixtures that you need to know. And I would suggest that you highlight these terms because we will be talking about them a lot. The first is a homogeneous mixture, and the second is a heterogeneous mixture. For the homogeneous mixture, you may also hear it referred to as a homogeneous mixture, depending on what resource it is that you are reading or listening to more so. So a homogeneous mixture is a mixture with uniform characteristics throughout. So an example would be salt water. For a homogeneous mixture, basically you're looking at what the solution looks like. If it looks uniform, basically meaning the same all throughout, then it's going to be a homogeneous mixture. A heterogeneous mixture, on the other hand, is a mixture that has parts with different compositions, so it's not uniform throughout the mixture. An example would be mixing oil and water. So with the heterogeneous mixture, you can actually see the difference between the mixtures, between the actual solutions. So you guys all at this point hopefully know that when you mix water and oil together, that they separate. You can actually see the difference. Whereas if you're looking at a homogeneous mixture, you would not be able to see the difference. It would look the same. So think of homogeneous, that term homo, as being same, and then hetero as being different. That's where we're going to stop our notes for today. You need to make sure that you put your notes away someplace safe because we will be finishing them up later this week, most likely tomorrow. So please put them someplace safe and do not lose them.